And I suppose coming into harvest, the soils were plenty damp enough across the country, would you say?
Yeah, I think that's right. Variably, but where we get those days of sun, they're still drying out quite quickly on the surface. Well, one thing I found as a general thing over the last couple of seasons, and it probably both the last couple have been quite extreme, haven't they, in terms of periods of extended wet followed by, for example, wet winter followed by a spring that became dry and didn't rain then for a number of weeks. And we've had those extremes, which is, I think the 2 years combined have created challenges probably nearer the surface on many soils. You know, that if there are issues, it's in a fairly concentrated surface plate in many cases. I think the intensity of rainfall compounded has sort of has led to, if fines have been destabilized from the surface, any of those surface aggregates that normally weather, if it's destabilized those fines, they've washed down and if you like, in effect, block the filter up within the upper horizon, the upper zone down to 4-6 inches in old money, you know, 10, 12, 15 centimeters. And it tends to be those areas that are tough and are probably less permeable. So when it does rain, the infiltration has been somewhat compromised. However, then we've had that extreme dry spring where cracking, you know, down through cracking occurred. So I think the surface is creating a few issues for farmers at the moment.
Yeah. And in terms of chopping straw and baling and that sort of thing, there's just a few things to watch out for in terms of compaction avoidance.
Yeah, prevention for sure been better than cure here, keeping pressures down wherever possible within safe limits, clearly. I appreciate, you know, it's easy for me to say that and somewhat more challenging for farmers to be able to achieve it if they've got big distances to travel between fields and blocks. But keeping those pressures to a safe minimum makes a massive difference, as does controlling where you drive and avoiding, you know, random trafficking if at all possible. And you know, the reality of the situation then is it's going to focus damage to areas where harvest, carting, bale movement, loading has been done. If that's, you know, if that's the case, then at least it concentrates the mind and it focuses you on where those areas are, and if remediation's got to be done, then hopefully there's less of it and it's not across the whole field if at all possible.
Yeah, for sure. And then moving on to autumn cultivations, what would you think? Where would a farmer need to start if he's deciding what cultivations? Is it a prophylactic, go out with the subsoil and do the lot, or is it field by field or crop by crop, go out with a spade and have a look?
Yeah, I think, Harry, you're right with the latter. Clearly I'm very biased towards that, but yeah, get out there with a spade, have a look. I think as a general rule, if you've got in the back of your mind that the fields probably are not going to be consistent, particularly from a, you know, across the enterprise as a whole, but possibly even turning headland areas to other parts of the field, use the previous crop as an indicator. I would first of all go to a reasonably okay looking area and have a dig there. It gets you the feel for what you're going to be expecting. You know, if we've got that plate we talked about earlier on that tough zone, even in areas where we haven't traffic, then you'll feel that with a spade, and there might not be a lot wrong with that. That just might be quite tough because it's probably very firm. It might have dried out on the surface. So calibrate the spade in those areas and then move on to areas in the field you know are probably at more challenged, and you'll get a picture of whether, as you've said, whether you should attack the whole field or just certain parts of it. As a general rule, over the last few years, and where I see a progression to, let's say, a less is more approach. Whenever I've been on farm with a farmer who's sort of asked me on to have a look and confirm with him, we've generally come to the conclusion that probably the areas of damage are less than they expected.
Yeah, okay. And in terms of depth and the use of wings and leg design, what's your thoughts on that for this season?
I think in terms of depths, yeah, let the spade find out for you, and then it may be that we can address areas where roots, that there are barriers to either water or roots. That should be fairly obvious.
Yeah.
We've got probably wheelings then which are clearly evident, but the spade will tell you just how deep that effect goes. It hopefully, if we can minimize and work with reducing pressure, then that depth effect isn't too great. It's a question then of just subtly stretching the soil to basically produce some vertical cracks so that they can be exploited by roots of the next crop or any intervening crop that might be grown, or even volunteers. You know, if you've got a healthy amount of volunteers there that are growing, their roots are going to do a bit of good in terms of structuring. You just need to give them and clearly the following commercial crops roots the ability to get through and start to go through vertically down the soil, and then they can start to exploit horizontally when they get going. But if we haven't got pathways for roots and we haven't got pathways for water, then I would suggest that needs addressing.
Yeah. Right. So, and as needs basis in different parts of the field, headlands and that sort of thing. Don't be afraid of getting in there and restructuring if you need to.
100%. And I think therein lies a not a word of warning, but just a comment that if a turning headland by definition is going to be more traffic, then it really is important not to overdo a loosening process there. You know, a subtle lift and stretch to produce vertical cracks. Between those vertical cracks, we're going to end up with quite strong supportive columns, and those columns are very, very important to be able to support the traffic and support the field basically. And destroying them is going to lead to that being even more vulnerable to further traffic and compaction later on. So I think less is more here. You know, a very low disturbance approach, subtle approach to just lift and stretch the soil should be one, particularly on, well, everywhere, but particularly on turning headlands, should be taken. So we're not resorting those areas to being very vulnerable and more traffic, because they're going to get it. They're going to get it when we drill. They're going to get it, you know, a number of occasions. So certainly go for a less is more approach there.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess the same is true for getting in and restructuring tram lines if you've got any ruts to deal with. The same sort of thing.
100%, Harry. I think now that there is a little bit of a choice here, depending on whether those tram lines are fixed and remain constantly in the same place. If that's the case and they're, we say, nailed on by RTK or whatever, if they're generally in the same place, then the worst thing, quite honestly, you can do is bang a tine straight down the middle of them, because you're going to destroy that natural support, that column support. And the other thing that'll do is it'll encourage water to drain straight into the middle of a permanent wheelway, and it becomes a wetter one. Sprayer man gets annoyed or frustrated that they can't get on as quickly when appropriate. So under those conditions, I would suggest an approach where you loosen from either side and rely on the loosening stretching effect producing those vertical columns. And if we don't quite move all the soil directly under the middle of the tram line, I don't believe that's a problem. What we've done is then we've put two loosening tines, a loosening tine to either side of the each tramline wheelway. It's encouraging water to where the roots of the crop are next, which is great, as opposed to in the middle. And it's producing as a more supportive wheelway. If there's been some quite extreme weather, and you know what it's like on a tram line, that they often look worse than they are because of that squeezing out sideways effect of the tyres going permanently up and down the same line. You often get a bit of a squidged out effect. Well, if you can encourage some of that soil to be pushed back in again by that loosening process, it'll actually do a little bit of a leveling off action for you as well.
Yeah, yeah, great stuff. And then if we're moving into a direct drill, strip till or no till environment, if we're getting involved with that, is there any preparations ahead of time? Any dealings with crop residue from the combine to think about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. It's a very, very good point. I think consistency of residues is very important. So if there's a chop and a spread, it wants to be consistent. If we're thinking about doing less cultivations or eliminating most cultivations, and it's really down to the type of drill that's available then, and it may be if farmers sort of dipping a toe in the water at an early stage, there might be getting a contractor in for doing that, then that can give you a little bit more, a few more options. But if the drill is capable of coping with longer lengths of residue left attached to the ground, because you generally remain in control of residues if one end of them's fixed. So if the roots are still intact, I think you can afford to leave a longer stubble. A lot of reduced till or direct drill type bits of kit will cope better with that than with a cotton wool mass of very loose surface residue that isn't really in control anymore.
And I suppose then it's get the combine header as high as you dare, really, to get all of the crop in, but leave as much of the crop residue still anchored to the ground.
Yeah, provided the drill can cope with that, I think that's a pretty good approach. It'll be surprising how quickly those residues, I mean, it'll look a bit ragged and woolly for a start. It isn't often what the old traditional farmer's eye would look at and think, oh, that looks a bit of a mess, you know, but the crop actually can look very patchy. And this is something that you can often get caught out with. I have in the past. You know, you can look at a direct drill field that's got a long length of stubble, and it can look hugely patchy in places. But what you're actually looking at is the effect of the straw masking what's probably quite a nicely established and consistent crop coming through. So you do need to get in and have a good look through that, because your eye can be kidded quite quickly in that respect.
Yeah, and taking it one step further, using a stripper header, there's drills out there that can cope with that level of crop material as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's as far as really as you want to go. Sometimes in the early stages of a move to reduce till or direct drilling, then some residue removal, although it might sound, you know, completely counterintuitive, we're trying to put residues back and resilience back in the soil, but removing some residues, particularly green straw, you know, and relatively unripe straw, can help, particularly if that's returned later on as FYM. And I accept completely the comments about damage by bailing off and then spreading, but returning FYM to soil or straw by an FYM approach generally does really benefit the soil biology. You know, it's helping that to improve and to produce more resilience in itself then.
Yeah, good stuff, good stuff. And I know it's a no-brainer, but just a reminder, really, tyre pressures after corn carting needed readjusting, and tyre technology is coming into its own as well now. What do you think, Philip?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, as you know, Harry, I've been involved with a number of my clients on looking at the effect of drilling tractor tyre pressures on yield. I know I've skittled off the subject. I'll come back to it in a minute in terms of carting and stuff. But I've just literally taken my samples from this season from a couple of growers where we've lowered tyre pressures on the drill tractor incrementally, and I'm looking to assess the yield effect in those areas compared to untrafficked, and as pressures have been reduced. And I can tell from the bags I've been collecting, the heads, ready to rub the grains out. I can tell just by the amount of heads I've got how significant the difference is between trafficking soil at 1 bar and trafficking soil at 0.6 or 0.7. What difference that can make to a winter or spring cereal crop yield is a factor of, yield reductions of 35% in some cases. So yeah, the whole principle of minimizing pressures to safe limits, whatever you're doing, but clearly there's an effect then, or there's a absolute requirement at highest speed road transport, field to field or farm to farm. We've got to be prepared to put those back up again, and the variable pressure technologies that are available, I hope and believe that as they become more widespread and regularly adopted, then the cost of adopting those systems will come in line. And clearly there are benefits in doing that. Particularly, for me, the drill tractor is probably the most important, or a secondary cultivation tractor if you're doing them where the soil is vulnerable to damage. The drill tractor, clearly, the legacy of that is there for the rest of the season. And if there's one thing we've got to try and do for competing effectively against grass weeds and other things, other threats to the crop, we've got to develop and establish a competitive crop. And the easiest way to achieve consistency is to not put high pressures down at that point.
Yeah, and at first glance, you'd think VF tyres would handle a wide range of pressures and a wide range of weights, but you still think that auto tyre inflation systems on the drill tractor fitted with VF tyres is something that would enhance the technology available from the VF tyres?
Most certainly, and even good IF intermediate flex tyres, Harry, where you've got high torque. Because I'm very conscious if there's a high torque application, that might not be a deep implement. It might just be that you've got serious slopes, and high torques as something that have got to be respected in terms of inflation pressure to avoid bead to rim slip, because that's pretty terminal once that occurs. So yeah, getting the appropriate levels. For me, I still believe investment in that type of technology, VF particularly, because they're at a premium. I would get the tyre manufacturer involved, and I've got a good relationship with most of the tyre manufacturers these days, and they're all pretty keen and able to come onto farm with obviously some notice. They're pretty keen to bring their weigh cells and check axle loads and advise on safe minimum pressures for a range of applications. And for me, I think that's sound, because if the tyre manufacturer themselves are happy that you can run down to those schedules, and as you know, some of the VF tyres, the really more modern VF tyres, have got quite low pressure schedules still available. You don't have to run a VF at 1 bar. It can be capable of being run far lower than that, but it's got to be at an appropriate axle load. And I think that's where the manufacturer comes in. If if they give you those schedules, if you stick to those, then you're going to be minimising any risk of doing damage to the tyre.
Yeah, I do. And I think all manufacturers of VF tyres would be willing to come out to set you off with the. It's a day well spent, I think, getting these tyres set off.
Very much. And it used to be a general offer. I think these days most manufacturers will say, that you've got to be using our tyres for us to come free of charge, which you can understand. But if there's a good potential, if you're likely to be replacing some very soon, then again, it's worth getting those guys involved at that stage. The same message goes if you're looking to change a tractor or even hire a tractor. And I know we're in the middle of the season now, so it's probably this for next year, but consideration of appropriate tyre gear is good before you actually do a deal. Get the right gear agreed and fitted if you can. It's the most cost-effective way of achieving a good result for that tractor then.
Yeah, great stuff. And a few words on ballasting. There's a little bit of difference between pulling a trailed equipment and a mounted equipment, I guess. But I've come across tractors that are so heavily ballasted on the front that there's more weight on the front axle than the rear when the machine's at work.
Absolutely agreed, and particularly with heavy mounted kit or semi-mounted kit, bar coupler kit that's fairly heavy on the back end. By the time that's dropped down and in field mode, often the killer are the front tyres of the tractor, because you've got a counterweight there then that's actually not needed in work as much, and the front tyres then need to be inflated to a greater pressure just to withstand the axle load that counterweight's imposing. So yeah, it's good to get ballast levels minimised within, again, practical safe limits, and all tyre manufacturers, because they've got weigh cells generally in the boot of the car, that they're very good at assessing and advising on the fine tuning for each specific application then, and that's always good. I mean, as you know from your old John Deere days, you can go through the operator's manual. That some of them are more user friendly than others in that respect, but there's nothing better than getting a bit of external advice if you're particularly bothered about high draft or just getting the right balance. But yeah, you're absolutely right. A trailed bit of kit, hopefully in field, in work, under draft, we want the correct weight balance. We don't want to be, for example, light on the front end, and this is as pertinent, if not more pertinent, for track vehicles, of course, particularly twin track crawlers. If you can see daylight under the front sprocket of a twin track crawler in field, in work, then we have got some quite severe rear sprocket loadings, and that's often a steel sprocket directly through a solid rubber track onto the soil. So we can be talking, factors of 2 or 3 bar pressure equivalent at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think most large dealers would have tractor specialists that would also help come out for free and set you off if you're into a new tractor this season.
Yeah, too true. And very important to do that. The correct ballasting and the correct tire inflation without that, you're not going to get the best out of the tractor. So it's massively important from a soil perspective because of pressure, but also from a wheel slip point of view. If we can minimise within acceptable limits, if we can keep wheel slip to sensible minimum levels, then again, that shearing action on the soil, that horizontal shearing action is reduced, which further improves or reduces the damage, further improves the chances of retaining good soil structure.
Yeah, great stuff. So then let's move on a little bit then. We've got our field ready to drill. We've got our tractor set, the right weights, the right tires, the right pressures. it comes to my attention sometimes that we get this classic hockey socking in wheat where it's a telltale sign of the drill has put the seed in too deep. Well, maybe not too deep, but it's deeper than it needs to be.
Yeah.
Perhaps establishment has been slower. Yes, that might get it to more moisture. But then, if we're thoughtful, then we should be able to manage the moisture at the soil surface as well. So, what's your thoughts on seed depth in different environments, conventional and direct and no-till?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, I think you do need to be governed by what the soil is like, where the moisture levels are, what the moisture levels are through the profile, and consistency of depth, but particularly, yeah, as you say, a sensible soil cover that the seed would want, but excessive depth or inconsistencies of depth aren't, that they are to be absolutely avoided at all costs if you can. So with regard to the drill itself, you want consistency of coulter or opener pressure if that's possible. You want consistency across opener to opener if there's relative adjustment. It's worth making the effort. If you've got a more traditional two-row coulter system where sometimes front coulter pressure can be different to rear coulter pressure depending on the pitch of the equipment or the just how that's applied, and it's worthwhile spending a bit of time, attention to detail there. Nothing better than having got the drill up to a good operating, sensible operating speed, just stop, walk back and work across the drill profile. Count where you've got, for example, if it's a tine drill with 3 or 4 rows of tines, as some are, then you want to be scratching adjacent, exposing the seed in adjacent drills where one of those is a front row and one's a back row, and that'll immediately flag up whether there are any differences in depth there, and so on. If it's a multi section drill, do the same thing on each section. Yeah, you could do one in the middle, but go to the extreme of a section as well, where a centre and a wing join, and check the adjacent drills there and just see whether we've got consistency again. All of that's just, I know it's painstaking, takes time, but it's well worth it, as you say, to avoid that inconsistent striping that often occurs.
Yeah, absolutely. And a quick roll on it on any situation pays dividends just for putting the seed at a shallower depth. A quick Cambridge roll is worthwhile.
Well, yeah, I think there's a bit of debate. It depends a little bit on moisture conditions, but if you've drilled and it's a little tender, let's say, as it could well be, particularly with some of the early drilling soon, then a bit of time for it to haze off, but then it's probably very relevant just to crunch a bit of tilth, just consistency. Yeah, bring that back up to consistency with a rolling action. Yeah. If on the other hand, weather changes or we've got a more of a risk of it being a little bit damper on the surface, then I think a little bit of care is necessary that we don't over make too fine a finish that could then, with an intense rain event or a significant rainfall, could start to run together. So I think there's a degree of judgment here according to how the seed bed is falling or how it is really. But it's a classic, again, slug control. If more residues are generally there because of less tillage or whatever, then slug control is again another huge factor, and rolling can help that sometimes. And if it's to bring in a few of your previous examples, if you're moving to a reduced till or semi-direct drilling or direct drilling scenario, then rolling to help to crunch a bit of tilth over those drill slots. Maybe not exactly what an absolute textbook exponent of control traffic would say here, but you might want to roll at a slight angle. Or even probably the better way would be to potentially to drill at a slight angle and then keep your roll up and down the tram lines and intermediates.
Yeah, for sure. And it'll also help with pre-em herbicides. It's still amazing that pre-em herbicides work so well, even in a high surface trash situation. But to be fair, they do.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's consistency. All of the ag chem people would tell you it's a consistent, aggregated, proper, a good aggregated soil structure near the surface is what they need, isn't it?
Yeah. And whilst we're on drilling at an angle, across slopes or at an angle to a slope would help with water running down tram lines and water infiltration generally.
Yeah, it can do, Harry. I've been involved with a few projects in more recent times for one or two water authorities, and even just work with clients and with farmers who would for example, they might use a strip till type approach where they've got a loosening, a relatively shallow loosening effect going on in front of where they're drilling, and if that's done at an angle to your tram lines, for example, if your sprayman's going to put the tram lines in when he goes, if that's on his if that's in his guidance system where the tram lines need to go, then running a bleak with the drill can and drilling everywhere basically can produce you some quite effective diagonal cuts across tram lines, which will, when water starts to run down a tram line, what I'm thinking here is before we've had too much of the crop established now, it's at the early stages. We've probably had that pre-em pass, we've probably had the roll pass, etc., down those tram lines, and to actually have some diagonal cuts, at least when water down a slope is looking to run down. If you can't always put tram lines across slopes, it would be lovely, wouldn't it? But fields aren't often designed that way. So if you've got a chance of water running down a downslope down a tram line, if you've got oblique cuts going across it, at least that water is always trying to be encouraged to one side rather than the middle, which is the classic place that normally erosion would start.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'll be different on every farm and every soil type, so it's very much a time to get out and have a look.
Absolutely, yeah. It's again, it will be lovely to be prescriptive, but there's nothing beats just attention to detail, field to field. Yeah, if you've got the time, and it's worth making it if you can, spade in the pickup or whatever, just go and have a good look and use the roots of what's emerging, volunteers, previous crop, use them as a guide alongside what might be an obvious barrier at a layer, and that'll give you a good starting point for planning what you need to do.
Good stuff. So many farmers at the moment will be thinking about what they're going to do in the future. I took the dog for a walk 2 nights ago and walked across a field with just emerging oilseed rape coming through. And if that makes it to harvest, which we all hope it will, the world could be, or the farming system could be a different place again by the time that's harvested. So thinking forwards, and if a farmer's thinking, well, what am I going to do differently? Am I going to change things? I guess the aspirations of the government are looking at more environmental focused, less soil movement, and that's leading on to a boom in the carbon capture market. So what's your thoughts on that at the moment?
I think I can understand where the planned move is aimed to go, and I think as a practical spin on that, I think it mostly when I go on farm, there's scope often to do less intense cultivations anyway, if they're doing many, which I think will be maybe a healthy prompter down that line. What I would say is the ability for soils to self-structure is very important. If you're blessed with soils, calcareous clay loam that's quite good at self-structuring, then you can work with that and do, I would suggest, quite considerably less at times. Take the opportunity to do less when it presents itself. However, if some of your soils or areas on the farm are less well self-structuring, or even, and this is the real world, isn't it? If drainage isn't good, then the need to just address that with as low as possible a disturbance, I believe can give you a win-win here. There is definitely a synergy between roots and metal in the soil in my findings, particularly on soils that don't self-structure too well. And if I've moved in the thought process over the past 20 or whatever years, I think it's certainly that roots are the things that do the job. They do ultimately help to and maintain soil structure. But if roots can't get through the profile, or water can't get through the profile because there are barriers there, I would take a view and fix that. I would fix it in a way that allows the roots to do their job, and that isn't extensive necessarily. It's maybe not intensive soil movement. It's just this subtle stretch, akin to a sward lifting action. If you've got a growing sward, a growing grass sward, the last thing you want to do is destroy that. If there's some compaction there, then it's a question of subtly stretching that, and that type of logic applied to an arable situation, allowing the roots of what's growing there then to do their job, I think has got a lot going for it going forward. And I think it does go hand in hand with where we're going to be expected to move to. Well, I hope it does anyway.
Yeah.
If you've got parts of your farm and probably the whole farm in a lot of cases that self-structure and are in good freely draining state, then take the opportunity and do very little and direct drill them if you can. But if they need a bit of help, I would use the roots of the crop that are growing, whether that's a commercial crop, the previous crop, or even a cover crop. I would use those roots to show us where the problem is, if they've got one. If they haven't, leave them alone. They're good. They're sorted. But if they're struggling, they're telling you that, or they're suggesting, can we do something just to help them? And this is the bit I think where we can really gain. We don't then need to go to a traditionally deep approach. The roots will tell you where their problem is. We don't need to be much deeper than that to address it. That might be quite shallow. It might not be very deep at all. It might be within the scope of a drill. Might be within the scope of a strip till drill for sure. But it might even be within the scope of a tine drill to remove that and set the field up for doing less to it.
Yeah, I see. And cover crops I haven't really mentioned, but they're part and parcel of increasing organic matter within the soil, and that's got a lot of benefits for carbon capture and the soil being able to carry weight of equipment as well.
Absolutely, and for me, the most important part of a cover crop's what's below the ground, because if those roots are there, their structure is as well. If they're struggling, if they're telling you they're struggling in areas, then that needs to be addressed. In my view, you'll get a better result in the end, because you can make those cover crop roots work hard, but you need to give them access if they're really struggling. That's where a very low disturbance lifting type action, if the field conditions are appropriate, they might drawing a bit of moisture out, you know, that might actually help you. But to subtly loosen through them as they're growing can be a real benefit. You get that little bit extra mineralization, but you know, what we're trying to achieve here is those roots to have a good passage through to depth. And as you say, there's going to be more carbon captured within the soil. The roots will form pathways for the next crop's roots without a shadow of a doubt. That works. I've seen it time after time. And you know, we start to get, I think if we can use those roots to do their job and help them where they need it, then that's probably a way we can move forward in line with general thoughts of the industry, where the aspirations are planned to go.
Yeah, and I mean we've spoken about the dealer supporting the mechanization part of it, but it's also getting your agronomist, if you use one, on board and challenging, I guess, what you want to achieve, and challenging the agronomist or farm advice that how are you going to get there, because they'll know your fields and your crops and your land as well as you do in many cases.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, a cover crop, for example, might be a heap of volunteers, supplemented maybe a little bit, you know, and that's again challenge that we probably don't have to spend as much money as potentially we thought we might on this. You know, it's a question of using all of that advice really to good effect. Certain cover crops, and again, this is something that has become apparent to me very clearly as I go around the country visiting clients, that certain cover crops work better in certain areas and in certain geographical locations, and particularly on certain soil types than others. And I think you've got to find that out according to what you want the cover to do, but also according to where your soils are at the moment. And you know, that's a movable feast. I think using the experience of neighbouring farmers, if they've tried different covers, can be a big help, be a big lift in the early stages.
Yeah, great stuff. Then even if we're focusing or thinking about a reduced soil movement system on the farm, and you think, well, it's a little bit pointless or academic because we've got root crops on the farm or field veg, but it's still worth pursuing.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. Again, working with, and I'm lucky. I'm lucky in a position of being able to talk to a lot of growers on this, and you know, that it's probably even more important, Harry, that if you've got a root crop, yeah, in theory, well, that will take us backwards, but it's even more important to develop resilience so that the soil can cope with that crop. And you know, again, many users that will tell me where they've embraced and have adopted cover crops in parts of the rotation, that resilience has built. I was on a farm over in Shropshire the other day that has moved to a strip till, very much more not fully regenerative, but going down that approach, and they grow both potatoes and carrots on that farm, and I was fortunate to go a high number of years ago before they adopted this approach, and the soils were very prone to slumping in those days. They took more getting into a suitable state for those crops. Now ridges stay intact better, they don't slump as much. The amount of work needed to create those beds is less. They can travel either slightly faster or do less operations to achieve those fine seed beds. And you know, this is really where we get win-win here, because they're doing less then on a more resilient soil. It doesn't degrade it as much, and you can see it moving upwards. And hopefully I've not blathered on too much. Hopefully you can see what I'm meaning here. If you develop that resilience, putting then the soil under pressure by growing a root crop and clearly we'd love if we could get them harvested at a sensible time of the year, etc., etc., etc. But you put the soil under pressure, it's more capable of resisting that pressure by whatever harvest, bed forming, tilling, whatever method. It's more capable of resisting that pressure. It's more resilient. It is honestly, again, part of a win-win situation, in my view.
Yeah, yeah, good stuff. And if a farmer's cultivating, drilling at the moment, or whilst listening to this, and is thinking of planning reduction in soil movement, and this might just get to a direct drill system, or they might want to eventually get to the a no-till situation. Is it a case of buying no-till drill and off we go, or is it a more planned? What's the top three considerations for reducing cultivations?
I think the number one consideration is what soils you're farming, what state they're in. Are they relatively freely drained? You have to have good drainage to go direct drilling on a repeatable, regular basis, whether that's naturally free draining soil or the drainage system is in good order.
Yeah.
I don't think you can, and the drainage system starts at the soil surface and ends up off the farm in a watercourse, and the whole of the links in that chain have got to be joined up from the soil surface through the profile to depth into the drains, if you've got them, and thereon. And that's something that you can't compromise on. That's all that late autumn winter work that's a pain, but my goodness, is it necessary? Very, very important. That's the first standpoint, good drainage. I think to have a structure that's capable of getting the roots through it efficiently. So if there are areas that need addressing, it may be it's not that deep, but that's important. I think it gets you to a result quicker. I've been on a lot of farms that have battled with certain areas on the farm, and it's taken the action of direct drilling a long time, some cases many years, to get to a point where that structure is in good order. A little bit of assistance can go a long way to speed that up. The last thing I would want for anybody, and the clients especially, would be that you throw money away by doing unnecessary operations. But equally, if you can't wait forever for yields to be positive and at a good level to be sustainable, and if a bit of metal's needed to get you there, then that's very well important, I think.
Yeah, great stuff. And then a third point, rotation, what do you think?
Yep, sorry, yeah. Very important to have a good broad rotation, different crops. I think that helps with everything as well. Weed control, that helps with weed control, doesn't it? Spring break, certainly with certain grass weeds, can help, along with managed soil disturbances again, particularly when you're drilling. So yeah, a good rotation, massively important. A broad rotation, very, very important. Yeah, and if you've got spring crops in there, I think it's essential to have cover over the winter period, and it's essential to have roots growing, put it that way. How that's achieved, yeah, that's down to the capability and ingenuity of the farmer to get there, but you've got to have roots growing in soils at all times if possible.
Yeah. I was at the Lamport project run by Agravista, and Niall Atkinson was present, and in terms of blackgrass control and a reduced or even no-till scenario, he was shrugging his shoulders saying, well, you could be expecting 2 winter wheat crops in a rotation of six crops, and 10 years ago it would have been unheard of. It would have thought you'd have lost your mind. But farmers reluctantly nodded and said, yeah, if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. But that puts then the focus, I think, on getting the fixed costs of running your business down, and making the best of your equipment and your labor and harvesting capacity. So 2 winter wheats in 6 is a tall order, I think, for blackgrass control.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I know that particular site quite well, and you know, you can think you're back in charge, and Stephen Moss's comment will always ring true. I think if you, particularly with blackgrass, if you think you've got your foot on its throat, keep pushing. Was Stephen's comment, because it's very, very adept at coming back, and a couple or 3 successive winter sown crops can really bring it back quite quickly on that site. But what is positive then is if you bang in a spring crop again, or a couple of spring crops, it'll go the other way. But it just shows how many weed seeds are present in that profile. You know, they're enough for many years. There's far too many to be exhausted in a year or two.
Yeah, and there's some serious blackgrass out there at the moment. I think as a nation, we've taken a foot off the neck or foot off the gas at blackgrass, and there's some serious crops of blackgrass out there about to be harvested. So it's
Yeah, you're not wrong. I think the last 2 seasons, the rule book was pretty close to being, well, it was against the window pane if it wasn't, going through it. But it became difficult, didn't it? How do we compromise? Where do we compromise to? And that's been a challenge.
yeah,
Again, I think it's probably helped some farmers in the concept of spring cropping. I don't know, geographically that can be a challenge. Geographically, cover crops can be a challenge, can't they? The further north you go, having enough time to get them established. So, there are lots of nuances according to where you are in the country. But yeah, it's a question of, I guess it's attention to detail, Harry, isn't it? You leave one thing less than perfect, or less than ideal, and that can turn around and produce you a big problem.
yeah, sure. And we've mentioned strip till, and it's a good direct system straight in, and it can deal with many a different soil condition, shall we say, as it goes. It might be something that the farmer would stop at, but it could be seen also as a stepping stone from a plough based or a deep non-inversion based arable system towards a reduced tillage system, do you think?
Oh, yeah, I've seen that work on many farms where they've used the strip till approach to take them to a point then when they don't need to strip till as much. They can actually direct drill, and that very much helps. I think particularly where soils aren't as self-structuring, having that little bit of help, that little bit of metal, as we talked about, in that part of the process. Maybe not every year, and I think that's something that again, it should be flagged up, that soil disturbance with a strip till system. If I'm going to be on a farmer's shoulder, I'll be prodding them, saying, "Do you think you can do less disturbance even now? Is it possible to reduce that within limits? We don't want to cut slots and
Yeah.
and create problems, but yeah, certainly, uh, and it's almost that word you used before again, rotation of depth of soil movement. If you do the same thing repeatedly at one depth, then you will create a plane of weakness, even if that's just down strips. You will create a plane of weakness that rapidly can be, it can cause a problem with these intense rainfall events we get. You can soon get sedimentation pans, or whatever you want to call them, at those depths. So varying depth of cultivation or soil movement is pretty important.
Yeah, great stuff. And then finally, let's finish off the holy grail, sometimes as it's known, of no-till. Lots of discussion, lots of research in the offing. I think Nottingham University are looking at the potential carbon capture from no-till, if they can get the funding. And it's an interesting concept, but is it possible in the UK? Should it become a widespread thing like it is in Argentina and South America in general? Is it possible in this type of climate?
Yes, it is. Is it possible repeatedly every year from year one on soils that don't self-structure too well? No, it's not. I think you need to take the opportunity on those soils, and we've talked about stepping stones, and that's a very good one with strip tillage as part of that. But yeah, in the end, it is possible to take those opportunities. I think most people I know that have gone into zero till with an appropriate drill, they've probably got parked in the yard somewhere. If they've got soils that are susceptible to not particularly good self-structuring, that they'll have parked there a low disturbance machine of some description that they might just throw in where they need. But the need for that diminishes over time. It's a question of, I think, getting there with the least pain and the most amount of gain at all stages. And you know, you hear people saying, well, just sell everything and go direct drilling. I think that is possible on certain soils, but for me, I would adopt an approach that at each stage, at each point in the pathway, we're trying to maximize the return for the farm. That's the most important thing. You know, it's a bit like cash flow, isn't it? You only run out of cash once, and we need to be able to keep down that pathway. And if that means a staged approach, because it's determined by the soils you're on or the climate you're in or whatever, the rotations you're having to grow or need to grow, then yeah, I think it's you've got to be pragmatic with this stuff.
Yeah.
You'll get a better result quicker if you are.
Yeah, you have. I heard two things at cereals this year. One was that when you've been out with your no-till drill, realistically, you need to be blowing it down with an airline, blowing the dust off it. If you're pressure washing the mud off it, you can expect poor establishment from it. Which
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I thought was a pretty fair comment.
yeah.
And then the other thought was that's largely linked is that if with blackgrass control, we need to get away from this thinking of the later the drilling, the better, and we can get it into the back end of October. And that's caught a lot of farmers out in this last two autumns. Heaven knows what's going to happen this autumn. But if you're into no-till drill, you have to get away from that thinking that you hang on for as late as possible and hit a date when the conditions are ideal and soil is friable.
Yeah, absolutely with you on that. I think the yeah, a delayed drilling from an agronomist point of view for grass weed control clearly is a help. What is also important, as you've alluded to, is the fact we've got a competitive crop. So if we delay to the point where the crop's not competitive, then at some point all of those benefits then go in reverse. So yeah, there's a pragmatic decision to be made here, and that probably then will start to push you down the line in some cases of spring cropping in certain fields. Yeah, because of that very reason.
Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. Well, look, Philip, I think it's been about an hour. We've been chatting away, and it's
Correct.
been yeah, it has. Yeah, I mean, it's been fantastic talking to you, and I think we've talked about all of the upcoming things between now and Christmas, and then some thoughts and processes that we might be thinking about from in the years to come, and where arable cropping is heading in terms of soil care. So remains me to thank you very much. And anything else to add to that, Philip? Anything that you've forgotten to say?
No, I think we've covered most things, albeit briefly, Harry. Yeah, it's certainly flown over an hour. No, I think we've covered most things. I think for me, it's a question of being adaptable and reactive according to what nature and the soil is throwing at you, because that doesn't get any more consistent over time. It's probably becoming even more extreme, and to be able to react to that, it is very important. And yeah, the rule book as it has been written in the past, we have to be more, I think, more flexible, and if it's possible, and I do appreciate certain operations probably haven't got necessarily the time for all of the attention to detail, and that is a concern. But you can't beat getting out there and having a look and assessing, and that's where, if you're a farm manager, you know, a close dialogue with the operator, very important, very important to they, you know, they can be your eyes and ears in most cases, and it's not long before you've got a whole field finished, drilled, and yeah, if in doubt, have a look and just confirm, I think. And possibly the other message is less probably is more these days. Can you do a little bit less? Biology needs oxygen. So if you haven't got oxygen in your soil because there's a barrier, then that needs sorting.
Yeah, great stuff. And it's interesting you mentioned that for those farmers that haven't got time for attention to detail, well, that's a struggle. I think that's something that if you haven't got time for attention to detail, you need to somehow find time, or
Yeah.
sit back and understand where is your time going.
Yeah, absolutely, Harry. Absolutely. It's that time spent is going to pay you back.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's the best. It's the best paying job you can do is achieving attention to detail, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, right. Well, great. Philip Wright, thank you very much for your commentary this morning. It leaves me really to say to everyone listening to this, thank you for listening. You'll be about finished harvesting by the time you hear this, but if you've still got more to do, have a happy and safe harvest, what's left of it, and have a productive and safe drilling campaign. Thank you very much.